Good morning, and thank you very much, Regan, and to the members of the media, to the citizens of the Western Cape. Thank you very much for tuning in to this Digicon with an update on where we are around energy. But before we get to energy itself, perhaps just a very quick summary of some of the things that have been happening in the last while. I think most impactful has been how the floods have really hit hard across the province. As of this morning, we still have 39 of our roads that are closed. We have 6 partial closures. That means they are stop and goes. Some of these road closures are pretty major. For example, at Botrivier, where the N2 is closed, it is a major wash away. Engineers are busy assessing. Some of the areas have still got to dry out before we can get proper assessment. And of course, we can't just quickly fix it. We need to assess, and I think the opportunity is to build back with perhaps more volume mechanisms underneath those roadways, because we know that with climate change, we are having more rain in a shorter period of time. So we need to be able to deal with that water flow. So don't waste the crisis. Let's make sure that that crisis or that road wash away actually helps us going forward into the future. But still, many people across our province are in a difficult space. Then, of course, not only the citizens, it is also the economy that is held back, the agricultural products that are coming now to market, that are those harvests that are going to be harvested in the next couple of weeks. We've got to get them to market, got to get them to our harbour. So we understand the pressure that everybody's under, and I'd just like to say thank you very much to all of the humanitarian organisations and NPOs that have stepped in to help people in dire need. Thank you very much to all of the disaster management people. And then, of course, you, the citizens, you've also just stepped up to help us out. And there is going to be a way forward. It's not over yet. Then just some really good news. This week, 100% of our departments and 100% of our entities in the province have received unqualified audits. That's something that we believe in, good governance. You've got to get the governance practices right before you get to service delivery. So that's some really good news, the best that we've ever achieved in this term. And we just keep pushing those boundaries to get better and better at the governance part, because that enables you to get the service delivery levels up. I'm sure I could speak about many other things, but we are actually here to talk about energy and the energy crisis, what opportunities are in this crisis, how do we mitigate, and what are we busy rolling out as part of our energy plan in the province. Again, something that normally provinces don't do, but in the middle of this crisis, that's why we've stepped in. That's why we're looking at various solutions to make sure that we become energy resilient. And I also think at the same time, use the crisis as an opportunity. Just as we're going to build back bridges better, we need to make sure that we enable new energy systems, new energy thinking, and specifically lowering our carbon footprint. It's going to give us a competitive edge into the future. Never waste a crisis. But with that, thank you very much for tuning in. And back to you, Regan.
Thank you, Premier. As usual, we have our usual weekly update on the energy status nationally. I'll now hand over to the Special Advisor on Energy to the Premier and the Western Cape Government, Mr. Alvie Lester. Over to you, Mr. Lester.
Well, thank you very much, Regan, and welcome to the members of the public and also to the media that have joined us here today. I think just on our presentation today, a couple of things I'd like to touch on. I think the first would be to speak about the generation output and what's happened between previous week 37 and week 38. And what we will see is that we've seen an improvement in terms of the output compared to 2022. And I think there are a couple of factors that have contributed to that in the last week. We've seen 1 or 2 of the long outstanding units coming back into service. So we see a unit at Ndrina and we see a unit at Kusile coming back. And they've stayed in service for the last week. So I think that's been a positive contribution in terms of the output. If we look at the energy availability factor, we also see an improvement. We've gone from 54% last week to 58% this week. And I think, again, there, the contribution is largely two things. One is you've seen plant come in and stay in for the week, which is positive. The other factor that's quite important is that obviously we're moving towards the summer period. And what we do find is that the demand in the country is slightly lower over the summer period. I don't think we must ignore the fact that we will have a summer maintenance regime that kicks in. And you can see again by the performance that the planned maintenance is in fact increasing. So there is a conscious attempt by Eskom to increase the amount of maintenance being done in the summer period. And that does lead us to, I think, what the outlook for the week ahead looks like. So again, if we look at the weeks ahead, we will see that it is red, and it's mainly red because we now start to see more planned maintenance taking place in the system. I think the one thing we must just be conscious of is that for the system to remain stable and sustainable and those units to stay in, we've got to measure them over longer periods. So units coming back and the reprieve that we've seen for the last week, I think it's very good. I think it's sends the right signal. I think now the focus should be making sure that those are maintained and that they stay in the system for much longer. So yes, more load shedding for next week, stages 2 to 4, but I think driven mainly by the fact that there's increased maintenance and not as much plant that's actually going onto the system. Thank you, Digicon.
Thank you, Mr. Lester. A bit of good news on that front, and we'll touch a little more on the issue of why we've seen lower stages of load shedding over the past several days. Some much needed good news on the energy front there. I'll now hand over to our special guest this week, esteemed author and academic, Professor Mark Swilling. And like I said, we are returning to the issue and the very important topic of renewable energy quite broadly, and the impact that'll have in our future energy needs, our drive towards energy resilience and a greener economy. So without further ado, a very warm welcome to you, Professor Swilling. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Premier. Thanks for this invitation. Maybe what I'll just do is sketch a kind of general trends that we need to be thinking about. As Albie has already said, we have an improvement in the EAF, but it's still below 50%. Sorry, below 60%, which remains a problem. Until we get over 60%, we're really going to remain in a load shedding type environment. Load shedding only really comes to an end when we have sufficient additional renewable energy onto the grid. And there's a lot of renewable energy in the pipeline from 3 different sources. And if you add all of that together, maybe what we can look forward to is ending load shedding in 2024 at the earliest, probably early 2025. The 3 kind of sources of renewables are the traditional source, which is the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producers Program. And as you know, bid window 6 at the end of last year, which was supposed to result in 4.2 gigs of renewable energy, less than 1 was made available, and that has got a lot to do with the constraints on the transmission grid. But the Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy has said that bid window 7 and 8 of 5 gigs each would be announced. We're still waiting for bid window 7 to materialize. Apparently it's soon. So that would be 10 gigawatts, which is fairly substantial. The big news in renewable that has emerged in the last few months is the amount of rooftop solar that has been put onto the rooftops of mainly businesses, but also households. That's 4.4 gigawatts of renewables on rooftops. And if you work out what households and businesses have had to invest in order to achieve that rather remarkably high figure, it's about 65 billion rand. The announcement made by the Minister of Finance in February about tax incentives may have contributed to that, but there were already tax incentives in place. So it may be accelerated to some extent, but the real driver of this determination by households and businesses to use their balance sheets to mobilize 65 billion rands worth of investments in rooftop solar is because in 2023, stage 6 became the new normal. Previous times when we've hit stage 6, it was regarded as a national crisis. The president, if he was out the country, would fly back in, all sorts of emergency measures. And that's what happened when the president announced his breakthrough statement on that resulted in the Energy Action Plan last July. The Energy Action Plan has now been put in place, and there's a Minister of Electricity who's driving it. The third source of renewables is what is often referred to as C&I, commercial and industrial. These are large-scale renewable energy installations that mines, big shopping malls or big farms or big industries are setting up. And some of those are very substantial. For example, Sibanye Stillwater, Sasol, African Rainbow Minerals, all three of them have gone for 100 megawatt renewable energy plants over the past year. They still obviously have to get built and come online, but that scale of investment by large-scale commercial and industrial investors is making an impact. So we have the REAP, we have rooftop solar, and we have the C&I, and those two might overlap. Exactly what the information is not always unclear, although the National Energy Crisis Committee is talking about 9 gigawatts of C&I projects in the pipeline. If you add all of this together, 2022 we crossed the Rubicon in many ways. It was a decisive turning point where up to about 30 gigs of renewables is in the pipeline in various ways. If just 10 of those come online in the next 18 months, we could see the ending of most of the load shedding that we currently have. However, that is dependent on Eskom's power stations not getting worse. So if the Eskom power stations, there's about 90 machines in the 15 or so power stations. If any of those machines really, really pack up in various ways. I mean, when you hit stage 6, roughly half the fleet is offline. So if stage 6 remains a kind of new normal and we don't get off that over time, and the EAF remains in the 50s or even below, then building 10 gigawatts of renewables is not necessarily going to get us out of load shedding. So the recent improvement in the EAF is a good sign. If Eskom can maintain that, I'm a bit skeptical. The only certainty when it comes to the Eskom fleet is uncertainty. No Eskom official can wake up tomorrow morning and predict with certainty what's going to happen. So you can obviously predict planned maintenance, but you can't predict unplanned maintenance when machines trip and they have to be taken offline. At the same time, the Minister of Finance has made it clear that the funding for investing in generation is not available. The focus of the future of Eskom is very much a transmission business. And we're waiting for the transmission company to be properly established. Once we have the transmission company properly established, then we can transfer all the grid transmission assets into that company, hopefully not with too much debt, which would then enable that company to start raising the capital required to invest in our transmission grid. If we don't invest in our transmission grid on a massive scale over the next 5 to 10 years, we will, no matter how much money we mobilize for investment in new generation, we won't be able to put it online. And that's the real challenge. But there's some good news there. There are areas in the country where we have transmission lines but without substations. And so the low-hanging fruit would be to invest in the substations. And Eskom has done a survey of countries around the world where there are substation manufacturing capabilities and are narrowing down where they would procure from. And if they put substations in these areas where you have power lines but without substations, that could release up to 17 gigawatts of capacity, which would be really good news, because then we can really put the renewables online. But it's, as I said, it's all dependent on the National Transmission Company actually getting set up with all the licenses, with the board. We still don't know what the board is. The board still hasn't been announced for reasons which puzzle a lot of people. So in short, just one final comment on the long term, that the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan talked about the need for 1.5 trillion rands worth of investments over the next 5 years. If we really are going to be able to achieve what we need to achieve. But the work that we've done estimates that the investment requirements through to 2050 is about 4 trillion. If we want to achieve energy security and net zero. And so the big question then becomes, how are we going to mobilize those levels of investments? In my view, there's plenty of liquidity within the South African financial system. The institutional mechanisms for mobilizing public and private capital in a blended finance paradigm don't exist. And you know, that's the big challenge when it comes to thinking about how we're going to finance the energy transition. So those are just some initial comments, I think, for where we are at the moment, what the short to medium term looks like, and also what the longer term also looks like.
Great, thank you, Professor Swilling. We'll now open up the panel, the floor to questions. Just to remind you, if you are going to be asking those questions, you could just raise your hand, you can do so. Thirdly, you can also post them in the chat box, or you can send them to me via WhatsApp or email. I have received 2 questions already, and we've touched on those questions on these issues already, but maybe we could just use this opportunity to go into more detail as well. The first one is directed towards you, Professor. You've gone into a bit of detail, but the question is there tangible evidence that renewable energy sources are making a concrete difference in helping us meet our power demands currently where we are now? And if so, are we able to put sort of a megawatt or a gigawatt, if I could put it so crudely, a kind of price tag on what they're contributing towards the power system generally? If you could maybe just
Well, I mean, Eskom as well as other energy experts have repeatedly in recent months made it clear that load shedding would be much worse without the renewables. And there was, for example, reference to the higher than normal wind speeds that contributed to a higher than expected output from the wind farms a little while ago. But I think the where there's a very significant undeniable impact is if you have 4.4 gigawatts of rooftop solar, what you're talking about is a whole bunch of households and businesses that are not drawing energy from the grid. Up until the massive increase in the installation of solar panels, you had a lot of people with batteries. But batteries on their own are a big problem for the grid, because when load shedding ends, you have to charge those batteries. And that was contributing to spikes and estimates that you know, that's an extra stage. But once you have batteries that start getting charged from your solar panels, that really does begin to make a very significant impact on demand, and may well be contributing to the declining load shedding levels that we're starting to see. So I don't think I've seen a fully fledged calculation of all of this being brought together to actually estimate, but a very reputable energy economics research institution based here in Cape Town called Meridian Economics estimated that if the 5 gigawatts of renewables that could have been signed off back in 2015 when the Eskom CEOs, Matila Koko and Brian Belepi, refused to sign the power purchase agreements. If they had signed those power purchase agreements and those 5 gigawatts are brought online, that would have reduced, according to that research, load shedding by 95%. So yeah, there's bits and pieces, but I'm not aware of a fully fledged analysis of the total contribution and how much of load shedding is being avoided as a result of renewables. But undoubtedly, it's happening. Yeah,
I want to maybe come in there, Prof. And I mean, when you were talking about the 65 billion rand that's been invested by the private sector to give us 4.4 gigawatts.
Yeah.
I mean, straight away, I was thinking about what everybody raves about is Vietnam and getting 9 gigs in pretty similar way, but giving massive, I think, way more than the incentives that we've put in place. And I think it's been driven by the desperation, as you said, of level 6. But 65 billion rand for 4.4 gigawatts sounds pretty cheap, actually, when you talk about 4 trillion rand for our transition. Obviously, in that it's the big expense of grid upgrade, etc., and probably we need some bigger machines, as you call them, or bigger plants in that mix. But wow, 4.4 gigawatts for 65 billion sounds like a bargain.
It is, but it's 60% more expensive than if we built 4.4 gigs of utility scale renewables. So if we built a couple of big plants, let's say 10 of them, it would have cost us 60% less. So rooftop solar is actually quite expensive. But you're right, for 65 billion, which has no impact on the fiscus, it has an impact in terms of tax collection. But it's basically mobilizing investment off the balance sheets of households and businesses. And I think that's what's strategically significant. That's the lesson. Because going forward, when we think about how we raise capital for our energy transition, how do we continue to leverage balance sheets? Especially if Eskom's not going to be trusted as a reliable off-taker to mobilize investment. And if there's no guarantees, you're going to have to find a way of mobilizing capital off other balance sheets. And that's already happening. That's what's significant, I think, about this, what's happened on rooftop solar.
I'm worried about getting into debate here, but I mean, one of the issues that we're working with in the province, and Ovi Lester was talking to me yesterday about it, we've got companies who are wanting to put in those, 100 megawatt solar plants, and we've got to find ways in which we can get them into the microgrids or into the municipal grids, and we've got to find ways now to deal with it through procurement processes, which are unfair in themselves. But I think that's also where we probably need to get a lot more urgency in our system in South Africa.
Yeah, I mean that's critical. But for that we are waiting for the Electricity Regulation Amendment Act to come through, which then creates the institutional and regulatory environment for electricity markets. So it's going to be until that goes through, which everyone is really pushing hard, businesses pushing the president very hard for that to go through Parliament this year. That looks unlikely. So we're looking at next year, and if the elections mess that up, we really get stuck, I think. Yeah.
There's a follow-up question to that. You mentioned that in 2015 had Eskom's top brass, and I suppose the government at the time taken this matter a little more seriously, we wouldn't have been in the situation we are currently. And I suppose this question is directed to the panel generally. Is there a mindset change? Was anyone noted a mindset change at Eskom and national government? And I suppose by extension, political will to invest more, to take more action? I mean, it would be silly to say we're not taking this matter seriously, but I think a lot of people out there are cynical, saying that national government, et cetera, aren't taking this seriously, and that's why we're in this position. So is there any sense, a tangible sense, that Eskom is not taking this seriously, and they're looking at renewables in a completely different way through a completely different prism, and that we are now I'd like to put my head on the block here. We're in the end straits here, where we could see an end to load shedding by next year. Maybe we could just open it up to the panel. Premier, we start with you if you've got anything to add to that regarding the political will from Eskom and governments generally.
I mean, my biggest problem is that it's all about urgency. Never feel enough urgency, and then some of our existing systems don't create that urgency or enable that urgency. We had a whole big mess up around a disaster declaration for energy. I was always in favor of having a disaster declaration just for energy to enable you to actually speed up processes, to give it the urgency it needs. I mean, I think things are happening, but I mean, just the point that Prof. Swilling's just made is how the private sector are the ones that are stepping up in that 4.4 gigawatts, and it's the private sector that are pushing at the system, wanting to deliver more gigawatts, but we haven't got the grid investment happening. I mean, I hear people saying, well, give us the opportunity, we'll build the grid. So that'll be I think there seems to be, but there's not enough urgency.
Is there anything to add to that?
Well, the Energy Action Plan is government's official kind of policy framework for resolving load shedding. That the large bulk of that was crafted by Eskom during Andre de Ruyter's time. So everything that he gets heavily criticized in government, but in reality, the Energy Action Plan emerged out of Eskom. And it was during the course of towards the end of 2020, when de Ruyter had his Damascus Road experience and realized that unless massive 5 gigawatts of renewables come online every year for the next decade, we'll have permanent load shedding, as he put it then, by 2025. Well, it happened a lot sooner than that. So I think out of Eskom came quite a fundamental change of heart. And that has actually influenced government policy. I was, along with many others, very critical of the appointment of a minister for electricity. But I've changed my view. I think what Ramaphosa has done is introduced a new style of politics, weekly press conferences. He holds think tank sessions where he personally participates and takes notes the whole day. There's contradictory messaging, yes. But on the whole, I think what he has managed to do, which is what we've needed for a very long time, is stitch together some kind of policy consensus within the ANC elite and government that we have to face these challenges and mobilize the investments that are required to make it happen, in particular in renewables. So initially, he was critical of renewables. He's completely changed his tune. He talks about 30 gigawatts of renewables is required. And that's just because of the sheer technical, institutional, and financial realities. And he's not a stupid guy. He's absorbed the information and he's saying that, on the whole, most of the time, the right things. That is new, I think. Yeah.
Les, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think there's certainly been a change at the Eskom leadership level in terms of the views on renewables. If I look at 10 years ago, or even slightly longer, the drive was still around how do we sell electrons and how do we get more coal into the system. I think the fact that it's not sustainable, that's the first thing. The second is that you've got a international and a national market that's shifting, an industry that's changing. If Eskom doesn't change, Eskom's going to be found wanting. And already you find that, Eskom's limitations are in fact the ability to make the shift from fossil fuel into the renewable space. I think a positive is the creation of the JET office at Eskom. I think that was a very positive one. I must also say the last chief exec put a lot more energy into the renewable space in Eskom than we saw in the past. So I think there is this reality that, this shift has to happen. And I think load shedding has created the burning platform that we require to make the shift.
Thank you. While the spotlight's on you, Mr. Les, I think you could start off with answering this question. The slight reprieve from the high stages of load shedding we've seen. Could you elaborate a little more on why we've seen much needed and much welcomed reprieve, at least for now?
I think, again, driven mainly by two factors. One is you've seen units come back into the system that were out on long maintenance outages. So if I look at the Kusile unit specifically, it's come back after being out for close to 6 months. And so we start to see at least 600 megawatts from one unit come back into the system. So that certainly helped. Then we've seen from some of the other power stations, 1 or 2 units come back into the system and remain in the system for, it's been over a week now that we've seen those units in the system. So that is quite positive. So we've got more generation coming back into the system. We also then find ourselves in a sort of period of the year where the load or the demand is in fact lower. And you start to see that that demand also assists with the generation capacity that we have available. I do want to point out, and I think it is quite important for people to note, that the reprieve cannot be guaranteed. I think if you look at, again, the vulnerability in the system, we see units come back, they stay in the system for a week or two, some for shorter, and then we lose those same units. We've been tracking 1 or 2 units at some of the power stations, and we see in the trend is that some units have been out 17 times since January. So again, indicators that you have this vulnerability in the system, and the unplanned factor is something that Eskom just cannot manage. So yes, I'm happy for the reprieve. I think it's good for the people, for the economy. I think the praise that we can actually keep it.
Thank you very much. And if you just go to the chat box there of this Digicon, you can see there is a little more background information that speaks to Eskom taking renewable energy sources, alternative energy sources, far more seriously as we go forward with this crisis. I think that brings a close to the Q&A session of this Digicon. Professor Swilling, do you have any concluding remarks you'd like to add at this point?
I think that there's this bottom-up response by households and businesses is very positive, but there is a negative side to it, which is it's a solution that is viable for those who can afford it, and it leaves a lot of people behind. It actually could reinforce our very problematic inequalities. And particularly when it comes to energy poverty, it might even reinforce that. And so what you're having is households and businesses who have the privilege of being connected to the grid, who are choosing not to connect, and they effectively are using the grid as a battery to some extent to kind of complement what they can generate for themselves. And that has costs, and they're not necessarily contributing to those costs. So I think that's a concern that I have out of this bottom-up type solutioning that is happening in the country in response to the normalization of stage 6.
Great. Thank you very much, Prof. Can I say before we close, you normally give us a tip or always good advice. I don't know if you want to just give us that tip of the week.
No, thanks, Prof. So I think for households, again, in particular, I think when you've got food and you want to refrigerate that food, allow that food to cool down before you put it into the fridge. When you put hot food into a fridge, it actually changes the temperature inside the fridge, and the refrigerator requires more energy to cool that food. So allow it to get to ambient temperature before you store it in the fridge.
Right. Well, he always comes up with good tips that help us, I think at the end of the day, save energy, but also save money. Can I say thank you very much, Albie, as usual, but Prof, really good to have you here. Thank you very much for your wisdom, but also for continually through this whole time coming out with either criticisms or solutions. And with your sustainability mindset, it's something that we all need to be cognizant of in building a better future. And I think your last point about the space we find ourselves in at the moment around energy, which in actual fact is pushing our Gini coefficient in the wrong direction. And it's something that all of us need to think about. How do we use our systems, our tax incentives? And I think generally citizens, if I look at what we've done now during a flood period or during a fire period, citizens in this country step up very quickly to help each other. I think there would be an environment to say, well, if I can do it, can I have a little bit extra so that my neighbor can also benefit? I think we've got to continue to think about that, because we also don't want to have exactly the opposite happening, which I think is happening. But thank you very much. We really appreciate it. And to each and every one of you, thank you very much for tuning in. Enjoy the rest of your week.